Hello, everyone, and welcome to Going Deeper with Elisa DiLorenzo. I'm Elisa, and I can't wait to go deeper into the topic of X.E.S, why church girls tend to get it backwards and how to get it right. I want to thank this week's sponsor, Called to Love, experiencing your best marriage through the words of Jesus. This 40-day devotional is changing people's lives as they learn not just how to pray for their spouse, but also how to see their spouse the way that Jesus does. Get yours today at calledtolovebook.com. Now, my guest today originally hails from South Africa, and Joy shares her personal story of grace and redemption with gut-wrenching honesty and glistening hope. She's a conference speaker, a writer, a graphic designer, and a life coach. As the founder of Simply Bloom, she's passionate about helping women embrace their stories, step into their true identity, and live out the lives of meaning that they were created for. She's the author of X.E.S, Why Church Girls Tend to Get It Backwards and How to Get It Right, and Pinduka, 21 Ways to Awaken Passion and Purpose in Everyday Life. Now, welcome, Joy, to the show. So glad to have you today on this really big topic.
Yes, it is. It is a massive one.
Massive, because it's, I've read your book and I've got a copy here. Everybody, you can see it. I'm going to put it right there in the screen. This book it changes the way you think. I mean, you're so transparent in your story. And your story is woven all throughout this book. And, you talk about the fact that church girls, like the title, Church Girls Tend to Get It Backward. Where does that come from?
I know for me, having grown up in the church, we saw this huge shift between how the world takes sex and screams about it. It distorts it and it plasters it. The things that used to be hidden in the centerfolds of magazines are now plastered on billboards, down the interstate. And the stuff that you had to go looking for sheepishly and quietly is now delivered to your smartphone.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Let's see here.
And stays quiet. And so because you've got this contrast of a screaming world and a relatively quiet church, you listen to who speaks. And so growing up, that was so much of the issue, was the fact that the church didn't deal with it. It just kind of swept it under the rug.
That's such an interesting statement there, that the world is screaming and the church has been silent. Right. And so it's impacted how we all view sex, especially those in the church. How do you see that functioning as a life coach? You made mention of this. Where do you see that in your clients? Where do you see that in the women that you've connected with? And where are they feeling silenced or frustrated or quiet?
Yeah, we as a culture are more wounded sexually and more broken than we have ever been. I don't know what the statistics are of abuse and molestation, but it's high. Every time I will research one and I'll bring one, somebody will say, actually, it's 1 in. So I don't even pretend to know what the statistics are, But I know as one myself, and my husband being one, that they are high. Mm-hmm. And because the church hasn't typically addressed this wound just festers. And so we carry this deep wound and then we drag all of the baggage. Because when we have the wound that has kind of bubbled and festered, we tend to go and live life out of that wound. And so we often will make stupid decisions based on how we now see our self-worth. And as someone who grew up in the church, there was this holy grail of virginity.
Yes.
These overzealous youth pastors who are like, sex is bad, but they didn't do that, but sex is great when you're married. It was just stay a virgin, very clear. It was almost like it was an idol. And
I've heard that.
So for me, when that was taken from me, along went my worth and my value. And so there was nothing to say no to. So, as a 15-year-old, when somebody said, hey, you want to? I had no reason to say no, because my worth and my value as a Christian was now gone. And so there are an amazing amount of women who, after reading my book or after having heard me speak about this, because this has been a topic dear to my heart for so long, have said, that's my story. 75-year-old woman who have carried this ache and this wound, and then the ripple effect into their marriage for so long, because the church was synonymous with judgment and exposure was synonymous with abandonment. And so you just keep quiet, which of course the enemy goes, ha ha, it's a playground, let me come and play. So it's heartbreaking.
And I know you see a wide audience, so that whole idea of 75-year-old women coming and speaking and connecting with their message and saying, yes, that's me. And I'm sure you also have girls, and it goes that whole gamut.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. And this idea that the way you just phrased it a couple of seconds ago, virginity almost as an idol.
Yes.
Right? That we aren't teaching, and maybe you're going to speak on this, but we aren't teaching our children, and I'm going to say children because it's not just girls or boys, that sex inside of marriage is an amazing thing. So often they're getting the message, don't have sex, don't have sex, don't have sex, don't have sex. And yet, like you said earlier, society is screaming at them, have sex. It's all over billboards. You can't, there was a Carl's Jr. commercial, fast food commercial years ago that I remember seeing all over the internet. But I remember, more importantly, watching my 7-year-old son walk through the living room while this commercial was on, and literally his eyes just glazed to the screen. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's where it starts, because that message of sex. And yet, if we're waiting for somebody else to change that messaging, we're probably losing an opportunity to teach our kids how sex is beautiful.
Absolutely.
But giving them so what I'm hearing you say is they really need to have the framework and the understanding that within marriage, first of all, that framework, and also still creating the value of the person, and not necessarily, especially in cases of abuse and things like that, where their virginity has been taken from them.
Right. Absolutely.
We've established value.
Right. We've got to paint a broader picture, because for so long, like we talked about, there's been in an effort to, and the heart was right, to protect the youth. And I was one of them, don't have sex, sex is bad. And so there wasn't the follow-up of, this is the reason why, like, here's God's heart on the subject. And I see this all the time as a mom. Our kids are 10 and 8 this summer. And so, of course, super fun age. But as we've watched them, yes, I saw that. There are days that it's amazing, and there are days that I want to stick forks in my eyes. But
welcome to motherhood. That's another interview. We'll talk about
such is life. But we see very distinctly that when we just give a bold, no, don't do this, and we don't follow up with, this is why, because this flows out of a heart of love for you, because we want to, and we just say, no, because I said so, it actually fuels a rebellion. And yet if we would be willing to sit with them and say, this is God's intent, this is why it's worth waiting for, then you empower them.
Sure.
Say, instead of just saying, don't do it, because that's not enough. They have to know why it's worth waiting for, which is exactly why we as parents have to, in whatever non-weird way we can communicate it at the right age, say, yeah, mom and dad, have a great sex life, because if we intentionally or unintentionally communicate, mom and dad don't have sex, then we're letting them know, get it all in while you can, because marriages are sexless.
Wow. Okay. That right there is probably one, for those of you that are listening, that is a nugget to take away, especially if you have children, that the messages that we send to our kids about sex, about what our sex lives look like, will directly impact how they view sex, what messages they're taking away. Like, if that literally blew my mind the way you phrased it there, that if we convey the message that sex in marriage is not something to be desirable, maybe it's non-existent, then they're going to work as hard as they can to get all the sex they can outside of marriage, with the expectation that their sex life in marriage is going to be yuck.
They're watching us. They're listening, and how we talk about sex. And if it's awkward, and this is actually, we wanted to talk about, how is it that we teach our kids? Because there's been such a breakdown in the way that church portrays God's heart in the subject. So how do we break that cycle and start a new one? And it's funny, because when I first started writing about this, our kids were too young. And there was like this, woohoo, this is how I'm going to do it. And then, of course, got to the age where our kids were like, so how exactly does the seed get into the mummy's egg? And so, now I'm going, now I have to, like practice what I preach. And yet here's the truth of it. It's our kids. There's this amazing and rather scary principle called the principle of first mention. And so whoever your kids first hear something about, there's an instant credibility and authority that goes with that. So if your kids are hearing about sex from their friends or from the media, there's an authority and a credibility, whether it's right or not, that now gets attached to that. It's the power of first mention. And so we have got to, sadly, earlier than we think, start this conversation, and so that it's this natural, organic part of how we communicate with our kids. Because if we don't, we will be trying to pick up the pieces later and try to reframe something that's already cemented because of that power, that principle of first mention. And so something that my hubby and I learned was, which we got to put into action relatively recently, was to practice the phrase, honey, I'm so glad you asked. Because we weren't. We were like, oh, what are we going to do? But you can't let them see that face, because if they see that face, they go, oh, maybe mom and dad are not the right people to speak to. Because my friends are eager to talk about this. Mom and dad are awkward. And so we have got to practice a knee-jerk response that says, oh, honey, I'm so glad you asked. Because God's design is just amazing. And to start the conversation with, the birds and the bees, quite literally. Look at the seeds inside the apples. Look at how God put that in there. Mommy's body is just like that. And, and to start the conversation when they're 4, 5, 6 years old, so that when they are ripe and ready to hear, it's not a kind of an unusual conversation. It's just a natural progression of what you started years ago. And so we have got to practice being excited to talk about it, because if we aren't, someone else will be.
Well, and I think that's so true what you said there about the fact that we probably need to start earlier than we think. I remember my kids are 14 and 11 now. And I remember so my 14-year-old, when he was in 5th grade, they were getting ready to have the sex ed talk or health talk, whatever they called it at that point in time. And I remember talking to some of the other moms, and I'm thinking, because Tony and I were already doing One Extraordinary Marriage at that point in time, my kids from an early age have had an understanding of sex within marriage, healthy, what that all looks like. Yeah. And I remember another mom saying, oh, we don't even talk about it. And I thought, oh my gosh, but they're getting ready to get education from the school. You need to be talking about it. And that was the same year that my then 2nd grader came home and said, Mommy, I know what sex is. And I'm thinking, oh, I probably made that face that you were just talking about, the one that wasn't like, honey, I'm so glad you asked. But we paused, and I said, so sweetie, tell me what you learned today, right, out on the playground. And she said, well, sex is when a man and a woman get under the covers and they're kissing. And in that moment, just being able to reframe that for her and say, you know what, that's almost right, but it's a husband and a wife, right? And I think as parents, we have a responsibility to open that conversation with the kids, to accept their questions, like you said, with the, honey, I'm so glad you asked. And there's a phrase that you've been using, Joy, throughout our conversation here. And you keep talking about and using the phrase God's design or God's heart. And I think that's so powerful, because then it's not just, mom and dad say, right? Which, you have 2 kids. I have 2 kids. Sometimes what mom and dad say is not necessarily what they want to be obedient to. Especially as they move into these teenage years and they're trying to figure out life for themselves, but to understand that they're, if they make a decision, it's not just what mom and dad say, but it's also God's design and God's heart. And if we framed God to be a loving father for them, then understanding God's design and God's purpose and all of the ways that God wraps his arms around us, especially in this area of sexual intimacy, then it's a framework that our kids can buy into. Yeah. Because it's not just a mom or a dad or, my parents saying, it's like, wait a minute, let me think about what God has designed my life for and what God has designed this gift for.
Yeah.
And it's powerful. And, when we move into this place of, going from getting it backwards, and you made mention of the fact that, the church has, kept us silent, or had a lot of silence around this topic. what are some of the ways that, those of us that grew up with this message of, sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad. And, oh, by the way, now you're married, so sex should be good.
Right.
Right? Like, how does that shift happen? What do you share with women on making that transition? Because so many people didn't have the upbringing that you're giving to your kids, where you're saying, God's design's amazing. Let me tell you about that. They just got, God says no, and then God says yes once you've said the I do type.
Right.
What do you share?
James Dobson has a great quote where he says, the wedding vows are insufficient for people to flip the switch from don't have sex to have sex and have it frequently. And that those vows are just not enough to suddenly say, well, here's your permission slip, now you may. Because you've got these couples then who have waited, which tends to be rare these days because of this breakdown, in part the world, in part the church. And so you've got this struggling in silence because, they don't know what they're doing. And where do we go? The church should be the first place that we go. And yet it doesn't tend to be the place where we go, oh, I'm having struggles sexually. Let me go and talk. And so I think as I have walked with women, and as my hubby and I, as we've kind of coached couples for the last almost decade, we have come up against so much deep-rooted wounding, personally wounding, and then also just a misunderstanding of God's heart on sex. Because it's almost as though in the church, and this is probably the more religious, old-fashioned way of thinking, but it was almost like we think that God was caught off guard by how good sex turned out, and then was like, oh, shoot, what am I going to do? I'll just leave it here for them now that they know, and allow them to practice the art of avoidance on it, because I didn't know it was going to be that amazing. It's almost like we think that God just was surprised by this. And yet you look at Genesis where God said, be fruitful and multiply, and do this before the fall. They were naked and unashamed, and the garden was rocking. And then the enemy came, and that's when everything kind of started to fall apart, literally in every aspect of life. And so what is God's heart on the subject? Because while the church has been relatively mum, God is not. The scripture is so full of it. God's written an entire book through Song of Solomon that is luscious and juicy. My husband and I, when we were not married yet, made the mistake of reading it together, which I would not recommend to a couple who are trying to abstain. Not the wisest move we have made.
My eyes are bulging. Yes, because
not a smart move.
That's okay.
We did learn that was not. And then we had to, who's going to chaperone us tonight? Because we cannot keep our hands off each other. But we made it. So as we've walked with couples, we have just kind of unpacked, well, what is God's heart on the subject? Because in some circles, some religious circles, there's this mindset that sex is purely for reproduction. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we believe scripture, and I love the way David unpacks in Psalm 139 that I am fearfully and wonderfully made, that you've knit me together in my mother's womb. And just even the hand, if you take the index finger, each joint is 1.618% bigger than the preceding kind of phalange from fingertip down to wrist. And that is, according to mathematicians, the golden ratio for movement. And so, God put that much attention and just the intricate detail of our hands. Nothing is by accident. Right. So with that being said, there is no reproductive purpose for the clitoris on a woman's body. It's not for urination. So what is it for? Could it be that God actually put on our bodies purely for pleasure? Because that flies in the face of, well, sex is only for reproduction. Yeah. And so you see God's heart of, here is this arena, play, get to know each other, enjoy each other. And yet, we don't want to talk about it in church. So the world has all of this fun, and we resent them for it, and we gripe about it, and we settle for our two-dimensional leftovers. The missionary position is aptly named. And it's about time that we just, kind of took back this gift that our Father gave us.
I love that.
Soapbox moment. Mic drop.
Dimensional leftovers, right? This idea that we can have fun, that God gave us, I didn't know that about the phalange joints, but it doesn't surprise me that our Heavenly Father would create us so amazingly that there are those ratios that are literally mind-blowing when you think about them, and to have these body parts that are purely for pleasure. Why, it begs the question, why wouldn't a loving God want us to have fun?
Right.
Why wouldn't there be body parts that seemingly have no purpose other than to make us smile and to make us, especially in this most intimate of actions, experience great pleasure and get out of that two-dimensional leftovers. That's going to be seared into my brain. I love that phrase. But to be able to say, okay, you know what? And why aren't we, as men and women, why aren't we exploring the gift that we were given literally on our wedding day? I tell my couples that I'm coaching all the time, I'm like, on the day that the two of you became one, it was like, doesn't matter who walked her down the aisle or who was standing there. It was literally, we have to look at it as God the Father handing each of you to the other and saying, this is my gift to you. Love on it, explore it, have fun with it, cherish it. But, and the word that you used earlier in the interview was, we've gotten into this avoidance strategy, right? Let's not talk, church, let's not talk about it. Sex issues, let's not talk about them. And yet, I agree completely that, throughout the Bible, I started counting once when I was reading through the Bible, going through one year, all of the times that be fruitful and multiply came up, and I lost count. And I'm like, that's a good God. That's a good God that is encouraging us to be fruitful and multiply. And I don't think it's just procreation. I think it's multiply the fun, the connection, the intimacy that we have with our spouses, because He designed it that way.
Yeah.
And it's something that we need to step out of and not just be like, so, as we're moving towards the end of this interview, what are a few suggestions that you have for maybe women specifically who have found themselves in this place where they feel like, I'm one of those girls that have gotten it backwards. And I want to shift to getting it right. I want to have, I want to know joy. I want to know God's heart and design. I'm not 10 years old anymore. I'm, a 40-year-old woman or maybe a 75-year-old woman watching this interview. And how do I know that? And how do I step into that in my marriage? What advice would you have for that woman?
Yeah. I think very much a multifaceted thing where, I did inner healing ministry and I went to counseling because I had deep wounds that I dragged into our marriage, and it wasn't a quick fix. It took many years for my heart to be as banged up as it was. And it's taken many years of walking through this. But it's amazing because, we came in thinking, the best sex is going to be early on, and then it's just going to peter out. And then one day we'll just be, and I remember my mom saying, honey, it's just going to get better. And I thought, how is that even possible? And they're going 42 years strong. And it's so true. 14 years in, we know each other better than we've ever known each other. We feel safer and more comfortable. And I know that's not the case with every couple, which grieves me because I understand it's really hard to want to be intimate and vulnerable with someone you don't feel comfortable with and you don't feel safe with. But I know for me, I had to get healed up because I couldn't bring myself as a whole person until I had dealt with my junk. And so traveling light is a huge thing. And I had a lot of baggage. And so kind of unpacking that slowly and just allowing the Lord to heal those deep places were a part of that journey of, before you can plant truth, you have to uproot the lies. And so uprooting the lies about myself, about body image, massive body image wounds, massive self-worth issues, just a very broken identity. And so as the Lord has healed that in me, That has hugely affected my marriage. And my hubby's had his own stuff to kind of work through and to process through, and keeping the conversation going where it's a safe place to dialogue has been really huge. And of course, as we walk with other couples, you know, my hubby and I have led a small group for many years, and we chose on the off weeks, because it was an every other week group, that the guys would meet and the girls would meet. And this group has evolved as we've moved, and so while we've led, it's been different groups and different seasons. And there has always been this sweet intimacy that has developed in the girls and the guys nights, that when we've met together as couples, has kind of laid the foundation for us as couples to kind of be able to talk about. And it's not just, obviously, we're not talking just about marriage, it's life. We're doing life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see here.
That is important to us. And so it's a safe place to bring your broken places. And so all that to say, being able to do life with other couples who prioritize their marriage is huge, because you will create more of what you're around. And if you're around people who don't celebrate that, celebrate their marriage and say, hey, you know, what you doing tonight? Go, you know, there isn't kind of a celebration of the
Absolutely.
the way you do life. And so very much personal healing too.
I think you've just hit on three huge things there. One is the healing journey that, you know, the size of your wounds doesn't matter. If you're carrying them, if you're carrying baggage, whatever that is, your marriage, your sexual intimacy is only going to be as healthy as the two people that are involved in it.
Yeah. And
so recognizing that you do need to travel light, as you said, is so important, that it's not a quick fix. You know, in our days of microwaves and, you know, the easy button and, you know, princesses with their magic fairy wands, we all want it to just be like, okay, well, I've decided this isn't going to bother me anymore. And poof, I'm all better. And yet you so eloquently said, it took me years to get into that place. It was going to take me years to get out of it. And I think that realization is so important for men and women to understand that. And then you mentioned communication, right? Keeping the communication open so that you have a safe place to have this discussion with your spouse, and pulling that out to the next level of creating community. You know, I think it's so important that married couples do life with other married couples, especially when we find ourselves in challenging seasons. And Tony and I have been married. It'll be 21 years this year. And, you know, life has not been smooth sailing for the last 21 years. I wish I could say that. Unfortunately, I live in the same world that everybody else does. So we rode the roller coaster. We are still riding roller coasters together in our lives. But having those other married couples who value marriage, who, you know, have those sweet relationships like you described of, you know, doing life together, encouraging, being that safe place to not bash on your spouse, but to encourage. And there's a huge difference there if we're all like just bad mouthing our spouses versus saying, you know, what are the solutions? What are we looking for? What is, again, going back to, you know, folks, a phrase that Joy used earlier in the interview, God's design, God's heart, knowing what that is for not just your sexual intimacy, but also for your marriage. And she mentioned Song of Solomon. If you have not read that book in the Bible and you are married, like, let me just put that phrase in, please don't read it with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. Because it is, some of the words that you use, juicy and delicious. It absolutely is. It's a book of the Bible that every married couple should read and should just embrace, not just for the visual imagery, but for how God illuminates what our sexual intimacy can be in marriage through this book. It's a beautiful book. And the imagery is very, very vivid. So allow yourself to actually use your imaginations as you're going through that book. Because it will put a smile on your face and probably a smile in your bedroom. Just saying. Joy, I want to thank you so much for being my guest today here on Going Deeper. I want to make sure that everybody that's watching this knows where they can find you, because I know that we have just scratched the surface of the wealth of information and resources that you provide talking about this book. So can you please tell everyone where they can find you?
Sure. My website is simplybloom.org. And I'm on Facebook at Simply Bloom, and then actually on Instagram as well at Simply Bloom Joy.
Awesome. Well, folks, today has been another amazing conversation as we had Joy McMillan here talking about, X.E.S, why church girls tend to get it backwards and how to get it right. I encourage you to go check out all of her resources, and I'll see you next week on Going Deeper with Elisa DiLorenzo.